What's up and welcome to MoAn Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello! My name is Erica and it is a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be doing a huge deep dive into all of the ancient Greek and ancient Roman nods that are littered throughout Sarah J. Maas's Crescent City series. Now, before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've so kindly done that, let's get into the video. So just as a disclaimer, I am only going to be talking about ancient Greece and Rome. That is it. Now, that does not mean that there are not other ancient history, other cultures, other mythologies that are referenced throughout the series. Here, I won't dive into it because I don't know those stories. Now, if you have not read the books, switch off the video now because I will be spoiling the bejesus out of this series in order to talk about all of the Latin and Greek nods. Now, that does not mean that you have to leave this video if, for example, you heard that and you don't mind spoilers. I'm, for example, somebody that does not mind spoilers whatsoever. So you can absolutely keep watching the video, but I just need to let you guys know now that there will be spoilers. So if you don't want things spoiled, goodbye. It's been lovely having you for the last few minutes. We're going to be splitting up this episode into a bunch of different categories, so you guys can find the timestamps in the description below in case you would just prefer to jump here, there, and everywhere, because there's a lot to get through. We're going to start with the city system of the Crescent City, move into the landscape, talk about the animals and creatures that are referenced, then the names of characters, and lastly, we're going to be talking about just a couple of random points that I couldn't fit into any other section, and so that's what is going to be at the end. But we should probably begin by talking to you guys about the general city system of this world. As a general blanket point, the political system of Lunathian and of the Crescent City is purely ancient Roman. It is literally just taking the Roman Republic and just popping it into a fantasy world. There's a Senate, there's a Comitium, and even the city in general is oftentimes called a republic. So just on that front, absolutely everything regarding the skeletal structure of the Crescent City is heavily influenced by, in particular, the Roman Republic system. In fact, they even use a word which is Latin in the book, which is either civitas or civitas. It depends which way you read it, and if you're going to read it as an English speaker, it would be the last one. Latin can be taught as V's are either W's or V's. I learned it, for example, as all the V's are said as W's. Not everybody is taught that way, but you can pick civitas or civitas. But that word in ancient Rome was similarly used in the way that it's used throughout this series that Sarah J. Maas uses it, where it basically means that you are a full citizen of Rome. Now, I'm not going to describe all of the different ranks of what it means to live in Rome, because obviously there were slaves and there were freed people and all of that kind of stuff. But the way that Sarah J. Maas uses it in this book, which is the people of society that are basically deemed worthy to be noted as a member of society, are given this title. And that's a very harsh way, but a truthful way of also seeing how it was used in the ancient city of Rome. So there's a little Latin word that you learned. You are so welcome. Write that down, impress people with it, be like, did you know that this is Latin? Ha ha ha. Maybe I'm just a nerd and I find those things really fun. But in case you wanted another Latin word, there is also a word that is used throughout the entire 3 books, which is the triarii. Now, obviously, in this world, the triarii are attached to Sandriel. However, the word triarii is actually Latin and does have a specific meaning, not really necessarily linked to what Sandriel uses them for. But a triarii in ancient Rome was like the third row of like an army. I know that sounds so silly, but like literally it would have been the third row of like a legion attacking another legion. Now, the word legion is also used in this series. Actually, I should have made a note of that. But the idea of the triarii kind of being these weapons, soldiers for Sandriel is used in this world, which I really liked. And I really liked the idea that all of the armies are called legions as well, because again, this ancient Roman reference is so heavy. And even though it's so heavy in the upper parts of society, it is also heavy in the lower parts of society. So, for example, that tattoo that Hunt has on his wrist, and a lot of the other people have on their wrist, which is SPQM. I know that that's a really obvious nod to ancient Rome, but I thought that I would explain that anyways, in case you guys don't know, that SPQR was this like ancient Roman sort of, I don't want to say slogan because it absolutely wasn't a slogan, but even when you go to the modern city of Rome now, you'll see even printed on like the drains and all of that kind of stuff is SPQR, which is obviously where SPQM comes from. Now, SPQR in Latin actually means Senatus Populusque Romanus. Okay, so what does that mean? That just means the Senate and the people of Rome. So that first word, Senatus, populus, and then que is the Q. Now, technically that's written as one word. Here's a fun little Latin fact. Nobody asked for this, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. The que on the end of a word in Latin is just a nice way of saying and then the last R obviously is Romanus. Now, in this series, in Crescent City, obviously it's not Romanus, it's Midgard, but it is that same idea, right? Which is that sort of like uniting thing. What I just mean is SPQR, SPQM, boom, same thing. Now, a big part of the society and the magic system in Crescent City is the idea of the drop, right? So the drop where, these people harness their powers, but they also hand over a portion of it to the Asteri. This idea of the drop is linked back to the Eleusinian system, right? Where is that? It's page 97 is where I found that phrase of House of Earth and Blood, in case you guys want to go and find it. But it's linked to this Eleusinian sort of idea, which obviously links it to the Eleusinian mysteries from ancient Greece. So now we're kind of shifting gears. Okay, so we were talking about ancient Rome and Latin, and now we've got to shift to think of ancient Greece and think of the Eleusinian mysteries that happened there. So the Eleusinian mysteries were most famous for being a secret religious rite from ancient Greece. Now, according to the myth, it's told in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in case you guys wanted to go and find that. The goddess of harvest, Demeter, she went to Eleusis in search of her daughter, who is called Persephone, in case you guys don't know, after she was abducted by Hades, right? So that's a whole thing. People online will get mad about that. But yes, when Hades took Persephone, it was totally against her will. Her mother goes searching all over the land to go and find her daughter after she hears her screaming and all of it. It's heartbreaking. You can read this in the Homeric hymns. But anyways, Demeter goes to Eleusis, she befriends the royal family, and she agrees to raise the queen's son. And so it's after this that she reveals her identity, because at this point she's been in disguise. They have no idea that she is Demeter, the goddess of harvest, this incredibly powerful woman. And so she reveals herself and she demands that they build her a temple. So that way she can go and retire there, basically. Now, according to the hymn to Demeter, the mysteries of Eleusis originate from both of these stories, right? So on one side of it, it is the idea of Demeter being separated from Persephone, and then on the other side, it is her failure to make the queen's son immortal. Now, after Eleusis is made and the Eleusinian mysteries are incorporated into society, the city of Athens then takes responsibility for the festival throughout history, but the festival never ever has any part of it revealed. It's really fascinating when you look at the ancient world and we're like, oh, this thing happened in Eleusis. And then everyone's like, we don't talk about what happens at Eleusis. It's that Fight Club over there. Like, we've got no idea. We have these occasional little reliefs and we've got a very basic idea of probably what would have happened at Eleusis. But for the most part, we don't know. So the drop being linked back to this kind of mysterious thing. I really loved this. This was such a subtle nod, and I thought it was done so brilliantly to kind of add to the magic system, to add to the world, and to add to the fact, obviously, which builds the series, is this idea that there's so much that the people of the Crescent City and Lunathian don't know. Now, the last thing regarding structure of this world is we have to reference the rebel alliance, the rebel forces, which is called Ophion. And that is because this is linked actually to a mythological character. Ophion was the first Titan king of heaven. He had a wife who's called Eurynome, in case you guys wanted to know that. But basically Kronos, to kind of keep this as short as possible, Kronos wrestles Ophion for the throne and casts the defeated Ophion into the ocean. Now, Eurynome, the wife, she simultaneously has to wrestle the Titaness Rhea. So in fact, this is It's a very strange myth, I must admit. It is not very commonly known, and in fact, the only place that I can think that I've actively read it myself is in Apollonius of Rhodes, which we've done on the channel. So there is a moment, one of the many moments, where Orpheus decides to sing a song, and the song that he sings is this myth. Now, it's not, again, a very big myth, but I really liked the idea of using that name because it's so unknown, like no one knows of this teeny tiny random niche myth. And I thought that it was really cleverly placed into the world, not in a forced kind of way. Because sometimes, when people like pick ancient Greek words that are like not really known, you're like, oh, that just reads a bit weird. This one I thought was really subtle and beautiful. And I really loved how that was tied in to the story itself. And with the city system, it is obviously vital that we understand the landscape of what the Crescent City actually looks like. So let's get into some of the parts of this world that are inspired by my neck of the woods. One of the most defining features of the Crescent City is that it has 7 gates, which is just taken from ancient Thebes, which I loved. In case you guys don't know, the ancient city of Thebes, which is here on a map, it actually had 7 gates. And this is a really, really prominent mythological feature to it as well, which we can see in the Aeschylus play 7 Against Thebes, which you guys can watch my video all about that. But the idea that there are 7 gates, I thought was a really beautiful nod, really subtle, beautiful nod to a powerful city, to the idea of a city, being able to fall as well. I think that's very important for the plot of this book. But not only that, but the theme of 7 continues with a note. Did I write down the page number? Yes, I did. So a note on page 7 of House of Earth and Blood is that the Eternal City, which is where the Asteri reside, is located on 7 hills. And the fact that it's on page 7, I didn't even notice that until right now. That's so good. So the 7 gates are a call to Thebes, but the 7 hills are a call to Rome. And obviously the Eternal City is Rome. That's what Rome is known as. But the 7 hills of Rome that even the ancient city was built on, I have to write these down because I can only ever get like 5 of them. And then I'm like, there are more hills than that? Yes, I just always forget them. The 7 hills are the Capitoline, the Palatine, the Quirinal, the Viminal, Esquiline, Caelian, and Aventine hills. So there you go. Those are 2 lovely nods in the 7, and the fact it's also written on page 7 is just a nice little landscape note about the Crescent City. There's also a shout out to the ancient Greek underworld in the part of this world that is known as Asphodel Meadows. Now, in case you guys don't know, that is literally just copy and pasted from the ancient Greek underworld, and the Asphodel Meadows essentially to them was kind of where normal people would go, right? So you've got Tartarus, which is where the worst of the worst would go. That's their version of like the burning pits of hell without that phrasing being used in the ancient Greek, obviously. And then they had the fields of Elysium, which is where all of like the heroes would go, or the best of the best would go. Then everybody else just hung out in the Asphodel Meadows. I really have always loved that idea that it's like, if you're just normal and you live a normal life and you're not too bad and you're not too good, that's where you live for all of eternity. And so that's taken into this world as well. So now it's on the map as Asphodel Meadows. Oh gosh, there is also one thing, I didn't write this down, but this is linked to the Greek underworld as well. So I don't know what page it's first referenced on, but there is a whiskey bar in this world as well. There's a whiskey bar that I think Bryce goes to, and it's called Lethe, which is a reference to one of the rivers of the ancient Greek underworld. So Lethe is the river of forgetfulness. That makes it sound really nice. It's more like Oblivion, like it's just like you drink the waters and everything that you previously knew is like gone, right? Like totally gone kind of a thing, which I thought was a really nice connection to the idea of it being a whiskey bar and like go there, get super drunk, whatever, you're gonna forget everything. But there are 2 mentions to literal places from the ancient Greek world that I really wanted to pull out and highlight for you guys. So the first one is the Laconian Mountains. Now, do I have a yes, page number 18 in House of Earth and Blood. And the Laconian Mountains actually in the ancient Greek world, obviously this still exists in the modern Greek world, but the Laconian Mountains is really that southern part of the Peloponnese, the southeastern part of the Peloponnese. That whole region was known as the Laconian sort of region. And that is just, there's no other reference that I'm trying to make aside from, ooh, look at this word. And similarly to that, we know that there is a place called Ionia, and that's because when we are looking at the sunball, the lovely like sport that Sarah J. Maas invented of sunball, when we're looking at that league, we know that Ionia play in the league. Now, Ionia is really interesting because Ionia is a very small strip on the western part of modern day Turkey, which in ancient times, Turkey was known as Anatolia, but this part of Turkey was known as Asia Minor. And there's a very small section of it which is known as Ionia, and that's really where all the Greek city-states were on this plot of land. So think like, why is everything blanking for me? Like Miletus. I just realized that's probably like a really niche choice. So I'm just going to be putting up a map, but basically that is the area of Ionia, which is again used in this series to kind of expand out and give names to things and all of that. And I like that it's only referenced in Sunball. I really liked the inclusion of Sunball. I just thought that was quite a fun thing to invent a sport. And to have Ionia be in there was such like a nice little like nod. Oh my God, my highlighter came out so fast when I saw that. But in saying all of that, the last note that I have about the landscape is Melanoe's Trench. Now, Melanoe in ancient Greek mythology is the Greek goddess of ghosts, nightmares, and funerary rites. She doesn't really pop up all that much. I just have to let you guys know. This is a very like minor deity, but I still saw it, and so I wanted to pull it out for you guys. And speaking of random things that I just wanted to mention and I just wanted to pass on to you guys, we should move in to talking about some of the animals and creatures from Greek myth that are referenced in Crescent City. First one, which is so obvious, is that Bryce has a chimera. I kind of loved that. I thought it was a bit weird, but at the same time I was like, screw it. It's a fantasy world. You can do whatever the hell you want with it. For those of you who don't know, a chimera in Greek mythology is a fire-breathing monster which resembles a lion, a goat, and a serpent. So the front part of it is a lion, so like the little face is a lion, and then we've got the serpent as the tail, and then the goat in the middle. So it's a really weird-looking monster is what I'm trying to tell you. And Bryce has that as a pet. There are also satyrs that are just noted as like running around the city. They are a creature that inhabits the city. So there you go. But also there are fauns that run around the city. Obviously, you know, a couple of fauns are very important. But regardless of that, there is a faun that is referenced in this series, which is actually a statue. So there is a statue of a dancing faun that is referenced on page, I'm really trying to find this page number. Page 12 of book 1, we have a reference to a dancing faun statue, which is decapitated, if I'm remembering correctly. But this page 12 reference to a dancing faun I thought was really interesting because if you guys don't know, there is a dancing faun statue in the House of the Faun at Pompeii. Now, this is one of the most important houses, one of the most regal houses that we have. It's actually the house where we got the Alexander mosaic. I might be being like really nerdy right now, but this is a really famous mosaic. When you walked into this house, and I went this summer, which was amazing, you have this beautiful statue of this very small bronze dancing faun. So I really liked that callback that even though we have all these creatures, also when it comes to the faun, the idea that there's this dancing faun statue, but also Juniper is a dancing faun as well. A very, very important mythological, but also historical element that is used in this world is an oracle. An oracle, there you go. We have oracles throughout ancient Greek history, throughout ancient Roman history. We have oracles in mythology. The oracles are super important, and similarly, I mean, they act in the exact same way, actually, where they give prophecies to people. Now, in ancient Greece, the oracle at Delphi was the most important one, but certainly not the only one. I think that's the main misconception that people have about the ancient world, that people assume when it comes to the oracle there was only one, but the oracle at Delphi was just the most important one, the most sacred one, so people really wanted to go to the oracle at Delphi. But the oracle at Delphi would only work like one day every single month, so the oracle at Delphi was seen as being unbelievably important and barely worked at all. There's just your fun fact about the Oracle that no one ever knows. And when you say it to people, they're like, what? Yeah, I know. Like, imagine trekking all the way across Greece to go and see the Oracle at Delphi and then to miss the day that she shows up. Horrifying. Like, actually traumatizing. There are 3 other random creatures that are mentioned. One is on page 301 of House of Earth and Blood, which is a sphinx. Now, a lot of people don't realize that sphinxes are used in Greek mythology. Obviously, there is a very, very famous one in Egypt, which is just outside the pyramids. However, the sphinx is a really big role in the Oedipus myth. So a sphinx, for you guys who don't know, is a being that has the head of a human, the body of a lion, and the wings of an eagle. Now, here's a photo that I took when I was in the Louvre of Oedipus with the sphinx, because when Oedipus is trying to free Thebes of being like imprisoned, shall we say, that Oedipus has to solve a riddle. And that riddle really famously is that, what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening. And the riddle solvent, what was that phrasing? The answer to the riddle is man, and Oedipus solves it. So there you go. Then we have a reference to a minotaur in the Viper Queen sort of area. She has a minotaur that goes into her little pits to go and fight little pits. Very deadly pits, but still she has a minotaur. And the last random reference is to Pegasus. I'm pretty sure it's the plural of Pegasus. Now, I said this in my ACOTAR video. I will say this again because the Pegasus do pop up in ACOTAR, and so even though they are in this, which one are they in? They're in House of Flame and Shadow. So page 219, the Pegasus are referenced in case you guys want to go find it. But as I said with the ACOTAR video, in Greek mythology, there was only one Pegasus. There is this weird idea that there were like flocks and flocks of Pegasus, and there was only ever one. And the guy that wrote it was not Heracles. The guy that wrote it was called Bellerophon. But speaking of Bellerophon and speaking of Heracles and ancient Greek heroes, it is about time that we go through some of the heroes, quote unquote, from this book. Some of the characters, the real driving forces, and their names and their links to the ancient world. So let's move into that. Better place than to start with Hunt, because Hunt's real name is Orion, which is how he ends up getting the name Hunt from Orion. So who is Orion of Greek myth? Because this is a very, very common name. People know the constellation, but very few people know the myth. Orion was a handsome giant who was actually granted the ability to walk on water because his father is Poseidon. Now, he serves this king of Chios. The king's name is obviously not important for the purpose of this video, but he serves this king as a huntsman for a period of time. However, he's blinded and exiled from the island after, there's a word that I can't say on YouTube, but after forcefully pushing himself onto a woman, and not just any woman, but the king's daughter. So Orion is then exiled and he's forced to travel across the sea to Lemnos to petition to Hephaestus to get help in recovering his sight. Now, Hephaestus obliges, and very, very long story short, the god directs the giant to this place where the sun and where Helios is, and that can restore his vision. So then Orion goes back to Greece and he goes to seek out the king to enact his revenge. But the king hides himself away underground in a bronze chamber. So therefore, Orion doesn't do what he wants to do. Meaning that he just ends up retiring to either Delos or Crete. It's one or the other. It does changes. It does change even in various different versions, but it's one or the other. He just goes, oh, okay, well, that's not an option. I'm just going to go off over here. That is then where he becomes a hunting companion for Artemis. Now, again, that story then kind of changes because Artemis is known as being a virginal goddess, right? That's a big part of her character. There are some few versions of the myth that Orion basically challenges that idea for her, that she then falls in love with Orion, etc., etc. But regardless of all the variations of that, after Orion dies, it is Artemis who then puts him up into the sky to be the constellation that we know, and where Hunt Athalar gets his name. Now, the other name that Hunt has is the Umbra Mortis, which is Latin, and it is actually referenced in the book. So Sarah J. Maas does explain this, but the Latin just means shadow of death, which I always thought was really funny because there's a note, this is totally random and just a complete digression, but there's a note that Bryce studied antiquities, like at university. Do I have of course, I think it's around page like, it's got to be around page like 100 or 200. I'll find it and I'll include it. But there is a reference to Bryce studying classics and like antiquities at school and how she always wanted to do that. But she had trouble getting like jobs after school. And I was like, oh my God, I relate to that so much. But I just always thought if he's being called the Umbra Mortis, that is like such a nice little like nod that she studied antiquities and she studied history and she did all this kind of stuff. And then the Umbra Mortis, who is this terrifying like murdering machine. Don't get me wrong. But like, I just like that Latin was used for him because maybe that was a stretch. But speaking of Bryce, actually, that was a really nice segue that was totally unintentional because her brother and also her dad, not her last name, but the family last name. So Rune's last name is Danaan. And a Danaan, for people who don't know, is a word that's used in Homeric Greek to describe the Greek soldiers. So when you read the Iliad, there are lots of different words that are used to describe the Greek. For example, Achaeans is another one, but Danaan is there as well. And I just really I loved seeing that because no one ever knows that one. Like lots of people know the Achaeans as the Greeks, but lots of people miss that Danaans is also used for the Greeks. So seeing Rune have that last name, even though it's not really connected to his character whatsoever, I thought was such a beautiful little nod to Homer. And I'm like, read the Iliad, everybody. I have a whole series on the Iliad in case you want to read it, but that's beside the point. Rune's love interest, so Mr. Danaan's love interest is Lydia, and Lydia's last name is Curvos. Now, Curvos is actually the Latin word for stag or deer, which makes sense because she's the hind. Technically, isn't the Latin curvus? I think. Either way, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm just adding in a note there. But either way, it was a really nice nod to the fact that she's known as the hind, and obviously she can shapeshift into a deer, which we see in the last book. Lydia also has 2 children. They are called Bran and Actaeon. Now, Actaeon was such an interesting choice for Sarah J. Maas to use for one of Lydia's children. And the reason is because the myth of Actaeon is incredibly dark, and we read about it in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So this is technically Roman, so all of the gods' names change and all of this, but whatever. When it comes to Actaeon's story, the important part of the myth, because I'm not going to explain the whole thing, is that he accidentally stumbles across Artemis, who in Rome is called Diana, as she's bathing in the forest. And it's noted as being a total accident. This poor man goes into this clearing, is like, shit, there's a goddess who's bathing. All of Artemis's little posse, I don't know what else to describe, handmaidens, something like that, either way. All of them totally panic and they start covering Artemis, but Artemis has already seen Actaeon. And so as Actaeon turns away to leave and to obviously give the goddess some privacy, Artemis, decides that he needs to be punished for this accident that he's done. This whole myth is to show you how brutal the gods are, in particular how brutal Artemis is, or Diana is. And she turns Actaeon into a stag. Now, something about Actaeon is that Actaeon is a hunter. So when Actaeon had been out in the forest, he was out there with all of his hunting dogs as they were out, patrolling the land. And Actaeon gets turned into a stag and he runs through the forest and he ends up being chased by his own dogs and eaten alive by them. I know I'm smiling, but it is a terrifying myth. It is an insanely good myth. I mean, there are so many beautiful statues to it. It is referenced all the time, but I thought it was really, really interesting that Actaeon is chosen as one of the names of the children when Actaeon himself gets turned into a stag and eaten by dogs. Oh my God. Is that a reference to the hind into the hound? We're going to just leave that there. If you guys have any thoughts about that, let me know in the comments. And in fact, speaking of, Baxian being this hellhound thing, which is what I was getting at there. I don't know if I made that very clear, but Baxian's last name is actually Argos, which is not only a name in ancient Greek mythology. So if you guys know Jason and the Argonauts, right? So when Jason goes to go and get the Golden Fleece and he picks up Medea along the way and he comes back to Greece and woo, that whole thing. So the guy that builds the boat that Jason sails on is called Argos. And that is why, Argus, but that is why the boat is called the Argo, because it's just named after the guy that built it, which is a nice little thing. But also there's an area of Greece which is called Argos. And actually keeping on this little posse, Sandriel's posse, that we have to to talk about. The two other members also have names linking to the ancient world. So one is the hammer, right? So the hammer who's Pollux. Oh goodness. Okay. So the hammer is noted as being, I did make a note of where this is, hopefully. Come on. Nope, didn't write down the page number. That's okay. But he's noted as being called the Malleus, right? Like one of the first times that we see him. If I can find the page number, I'll include it in the video. If not, I am so sorry. You're just watching me talk. But either way, so he is known as, the hammer is known as the Malleus, which is literally just what hammer translates to in Latin, which is quite nice. But his first name is actually Pollux. Now, Pollux, I just mentioned Jason when he went on his little Argonauts adventure to Colchis, right? So one of the people who's on there is a guy called Pollux, and his brother is there called Castor. Now, Pollux is technically the Roman name, the Roman version of this guy's name. The Greek name is Polydeuces, and Castor and Polydeuces, or Castor and Pollux, they are brothers of Helen. Yes, that Helen, Helen of Troy. There you go. You are so welcome for that connection. And the last member of this posse that we should talk about is the Harpy. Now, the Harpy, if you guys don't know what a Harpy is in Greek mythology, I think a lot of people favor the Furies rather than the Harpies. So the Harpies are just known to the nerds and not really to the general public, even though we've adopted the word Harpy into English. Now, the Harpies were spirits of sort of sudden, sharp gusts of wind. And they are oftentimes dispatched by Zeus to go and do his bidding, but they are gross and they are ugly and they are not happy and excited to be in any scenario, right? So again, I keep mentioning Jason on his little journey, but we have lots of links to the Argonautica now that I'm saying all of this out loud, which is what that text is. I've discussed this text on the channel. You guys can go and read it with me if you want to. It's really, really short. But the Harpies pop up in that book because they are tormenting this guy called Phineas. Phineas can't eat anything. He goes and he sits at this table, and then the Harpies swoop down, and they're either like eating everything or they're like making everything really gross. Like they breathe all over it, and it's like putrid, it's disgusting. And so when the Argonauts show up, their job is to get rid of the Harpies. And so the sons of Boreas go and get rid of the Harpies. So basically, actually, I think what I should have labeled this section is go and read Apollonius of Rhodes, because there's lots of connections to that. But since we've discussed all of them, the logical conclusion is to look at the new archangel, because obviously the old archangel, Micah, nothing to do with ancient Greece and Rome, but the new archangel in Celestina does. So her name is actually from Latin. Of course it is. So Celestina comes from Caelestis, which just means heavenly. And in connection to her, we then have, I think we say this character's name is Hypatia. I've been reading it as Hypatia, but the new Queen of the Witches, or the soon-to-be Queen of the Witches, called, even though there's an X in it, how are we saying that? Unfortunately, I've been saying it Hypatia the entire time because there is an ancient character. She's an ancient woman. She's not fictional. She's real. She is called Hypatia. So I've just been reading them in the exact same way. But the ancient Hypatia was born in 355 CE, and she dies in 415 CE in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, she was a mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher, and she lived in this super, super turbulent area and era even of Alexandria's history. Now, she's the earliest female mathematician that we have when it comes to somebody who's actually recorded and who has a reasonable detail about them in the source material. So she's a very, very exciting woman, and she was incredibly, incredibly smart. So I really liked that, considering we see, again, are we saying Hypatia for the witch? Whatever it is. So when we see the witch, though, she is incredibly smart. She is incredibly, on her toes about all this kind of stuff. And I really liked that linking in the name to the character. Speaking of the witches, though, the previous queen was called Hecuba. And Hecuba, if you guys don't know, is the name for the queen of Troy. From the Trojan War. So there's nothing else, because obviously that character is dead at this point. But yeah, there you go. Therion, we can probably move to him next, considering he and Hypatia kind of have a little, friendship going on, which is super cute. And he calls her Pax, and I really like that. So Therion, though, his last name is Keto or Ceto. Now, in case you guys don't know what that is a link to ancient Greek mythology, where Keto or Ceto was a goddess of the sea, but mostly the dangers of the sea, right? So she's very specifically the goddess of sea monsters. So any sort of large being in the sea comes from Ceto. Now, her brother, who's a guy called Phorkys, both of them produce this brood of fearsome monsters in mythology, including the Echidna, Scylla, but also the Graiai and the Gorgons. are children of Ceto and Phorkys. I still liked that little nod to mythology there. Earlier, I mentioned Juniper with regards to the faun because she's a dancing faun, and her last name actually is Andromeda. For you guys who don't know, Perseus, who decapitates Medusa, and he goes to get, the head and he brings it back because he's a big mama's boy. Perseus, he has a little side quest when he goes off to do the whole Medusa thing, and his side quest is to go and save Andromeda. She is being chained to a rock. It's a very long story, and he goes and frees her from the rock and says, I want to marry her. And so he then takes her back to Greece and he marries her there. In fact, let's just do a bunch of really quick fire names, because we have Naomi, whose last name is Boreas. I mentioned earlier that there were sons of Boreas in Apollonius of Rhodes, but Boreas himself was the personification of the north wind, because yes, in Greek mythology, all the different directions of winds have names. I promise you, it sounds really confusing, but it's not. The more you read, the easier it gets. Peleus. Oh my goodness, I have a note of a character, Peleus. Why didn't I include that with all of the stupid notes about Apollonius of Rhodes? So Peleus is a character in Apollonius of Rhodes. He's a character in Jason's mythology. And Peleus, P-E-L-I-A-S, by the way. He is currently, at the time of Jason's story, the king of Iolcus. And he's the guy that sends Jason to go and get the Golden Fleece because he actually wants Jason to die. I explained that in that whole series, but Peleus is mentioned again as an older character here as part of the mythology of the Crescent city, or the history, the mythological history of the Crescent city, which includes also the reference of Thea, even spelt the same way as in ancient Greek. Thea is the goddess of heavenly light, and she serves the Asteri. And I just realized I never told you what Asteri means. So Asteri is actually the Latin word that just means precious rock, basically. I literally don't know how else to describe that off the top of my head, but it's like a precious rock. If I can figure out another way of explaining that, I'll just include it in the video right now. On screen, in words. If you guys have walked away, look at the screen occasionally. There have been lots of photos throughout this video. But anyways, moving along. In this whole cluster of the mythology and the history of this world, we also get a reference to a character called Selene, S-I-L-E-N-E. Now, I do not know if this is actually a link to the moon goddess of Greek mythology, who's also called Selene, but spelled differently. In the ancient Greek world, she is spelled S-E-L-E-N-E. It could be a connection, it could not be a connection. I could just be seeing something that I don't want to see because they are spelled differently, but it seems like it's a little too close to be but a coincidence. No? And one of my last points that is thrown into this section is that there's a character who's mentioned in amongst all of these people, who's called Thanatos. Now, because of all of the ties to Akatar, and obviously the visiting of Akatar that happens, I don't know if that's the same Thanatos, because if you guys have seen my Akatar video, I made a note before I had read any of these books that Thanatos is there, right? He is there and he doesn't do anything, but he's referenced as being in the room. And I kind of joked it was like a blink and you'll miss it. We don't hear anything about him. If he pops back up, I'll talk about him again. Is this Thanatos that Thanatos? What? I swear, guys, we just have two more notes on names, and then we can move into the last section. And the penultimate one is a very obvious one. I have seen so many people pick up on this, but this is the inclusion of the character who is the dragon that is called Ariadne. Now, we haven't seen that much from her. I've seen so many TikToks of people theorizing if the myth of Ariadne is going to come into this. I have no idea, but I really like that note being there. I like that people are thinking about it. Oh, this makes me so happy when I see people theorizing about the ancient world and how it's used in different places. So I've really enjoyed seeing that side of things on the internet. But lastly, we have one mention of the name Vespasian in The House of Flame and Shadow on page 317. Vespasian was a Roman emperor. In case you guys don't know, I'm not going to explain who Vespasian was and what he was doing because there's a lot to explain about Vespasian. But just trust me when it comes to that name. That is a very important and very influential Roman emperor. So that was an incredibly long section, guys, but we are nearly there. We are going to move into our last section, which is now just some random things that I found that link to the ancient world. I even have one link to ancient Egypt, which even I knew. I'm not an Egyptologist by any means, and I have not studied ancient Egypt, but I noticed this, so I wanted to nod to it. I wanted to point it out and kind of direct people to it. So that's sort of the feel of this last section, is just some random things that I found that don't hold any weight in the story, that never pop up again aside from the one time that they're referenced, and they didn't fit into any other section that I've been talking about. So let's share some random notes about the ancient world with you guys from Crescent City. Okay, the first point of the last section comes from the House of Sky and Breath. More specifically, do I have a page? Yes, I do. Page 26 from the House of Sky and Breath, there is the note of a sculpture, and the sculpture is referenced being from Palmyra. Now, it's spelled differently, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that's probably influenced by the real place called Palmyra, which looks like this. Now, Palmyra was an ancient city in south-central Syria. It's about 130 miles from Damascus, and the name Palmyra means the city of palm trees. And it was actually given to the city by its Roman rulers in the 1st century CE, or AD. So that's a nice little reference. Probably I don't know if we're ever going to explore Palmyra, but still, I liked seeing it there. Especially Palmyra. Like, Palmyra never gets any attention, ever. Even within my subject, you have to really be looking at that area in order to get any reference to it. So I liked that it was there. I thought it was nice. So the ancient Egypt reference that I was talking about actually comes from page 207 on House of Earth and Blood, in House of Earth and Blood. Anyways, that was a terrible preposition choice, but you guys know what I mean. So in that book, page 207, Bryce and Hunt are actually looking for, looking at puppies, right? They're like playing with puppies. And two of the puppies' names are Set and Osiris, which is a really nice nod to Egyptology. There are lots of random Greek letters that are mentioned throughout the series. That's another random nod to the ancient world. So we get lots of alphas, omegas are mentioned, those sorts of things. We see a lot of them. I've actually written down every single time we see one. There's an eta, all of that kind of stuff. So you can basically learn the Greek alphabet from this. Out of order, sure, but you could, and lots of people don't know it, and that's a nice place to start. Unless you're in a frat or a sorority, then you guys have to learn it, don't you? But either way, you can learn a number of letters from this series. You just have to know what they look like in Greek, but you can basically read them now. You're welcome. We also get these two characters in House of Sky and Breath called Hesperus and Vesperus. And Sarah J. Maas notes that Hesperus just means evening star in Latin, which is bang on. That's totally true. I just thought that I would pull that out for you guys. I'm not correcting anything. I'm just saying it's there. And Vesperus is also the evening star. So it's just like a nice interchangeable Latin meaning there. Now, there are two notes of random Latin. The first random Latin that we get, which actually plays a role throughout the entire series, is the phrase memento mori. I know that's a really famous phrase, but I'm also aware that a lot of people don't know what that means. Like, why would you, to be fair? I have to know these things because that's literally my job. But memento mori just means remember you must die. And there's a really famous image of the memento mori idea, which is from Pompeii. So this is my own photo that I took this summer of this beautiful mosaic. But that's where that comes from. And that just plays a role throughout the series at various different points throughout the books. So you're probably familiar with the phrase, but now at least you know what it means. Now I only have one more note for you guys, one more mention. And actually this should not even be in this section. This should be up in a different section. I don't know why it's down here, but it's still an interesting one to end on, so I'm actually really excited I put it at the end. So there is a river in the Crescent City world, which is called the Melanthos River. Now, Melanthos, as a word, is not actually used in ancient Greece, but there is a character called Melantho from the Odyssey. So I'm actually really glad that this is the last one, because Melantho is a character who I think more people are coming to when they're reading the Odyssey. People want to know more about Melantho. She is one of the slave women who is left in the palace of Ithaca. That has nothing to do with the river, aside from the name. Melanthos, change it to Melantho, it becomes a character in Homer's Odyssey. Now, this is my longest video because there was so much in here that is linked to the ancient Greek and Roman world. So if you guys made it to the end, you deserve a pat on the back. Go get yourself a chocolate or a drink, however, whatever it is that you want. You deserve some time to chill out because that was a proper study session. But hopefully what you guys can see from that, and what you guys can see from all the videos that I've been doing with fantasy series, is just how much the fantasy genre takes from the ancient Greek and Roman world, and how it's a really fantastic way for you guys to engage with that world in a fun, vibrant, new way. I think so many people are going to be surprised when they actually move to the ancient sources, how much stuff they've learned from, even if you've just read Sarah J. Maas, how much you've learned from Sarah J. Maas is so monumental, and I think is so important, because making that move then to the ancient Greek text is not as scary as you probably, I assume, think that it is, because so many people assume that they're like these big important texts and you have to approach them in that way. And actually, you've approached so much of it already in not only this series, but ACOTAR and also Throne of Glass, that I'm really excited for you guys to dive into the texts if you guys so want. So with all the texts that I've mentioned throughout this video, I have done breakdowns myself on the channel. If you guys want to tackle Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, I have breakdowns of every single chapter. If you guys want to look at Apollonius of Rhodes, I also have breakdowns of all the chapters. That one, there's only 4 chapters. So there's only 5 videos, including a context one, if you guys want to go and read that one first. And all these books are so enjoyable and so fun. So I hope that you stick around on the channel for that. Now, I will not stop uploading fantasy reviews and fantasy deep dive analyses, so please don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of those in the future. But thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos on MoAn. I'll see you guys then.